I stood there holding the envelope, watching my uncle try to get up from his seat. He couldn't, not because of age or injury, because of what I'd just said in front of 200 people. Some of you are going to say I went too far. I need you to tell me if I did. The graduation ceremony had ended 4 minutes earlier. Families were moving toward the exits, hugging, taking photos. My uncle sat in the front row, third seat from the aisle. He'd worn a navy suit. His wife stood next to him with her hand on his shoulder. Neither of them had been invited. My daughter stood behind me. She was 17 now. She didn't remember the last family dinner she'd been allowed to attend. She remembered being told she couldn't come to the next one. That had been 6 years ago. She was 11 then. I handed him the envelope. I said exactly what I'd practiced. She got a full scholarship to Stanford, computer science. Full ride. They called her brilliant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The families around us had gone quiet. My uncle looked at the envelope like it might burn him. His wife said something I didn't catch. I turned around and walked out with my daughter's hand in mine. Let me tell you how we got here. My family has money. Not the kind you make, the kind you inherit and then talk about in ways that make it clear you've never worried about it. My uncle married into it. His wife's family owned commercial real estate in 3 states. He liked to say he worked in property management. What he actually did was show up to meetings her father had already handled. They had 2 sons. Both went to private schools that cost more per year than most people's mortgages. Both got legacy admissions to schools they could not have tested into. My uncle talked about their grades the way other people talk about championship trophies. I got pregnant at 23. The father left before I knew I was showing. My family's reaction was not surprise, it was confirmation. They'd always suspected I'd amount to something like this. My daughter was born in April. I named her Emma. I was working reception at a dental office and living in a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs. My mother came to visit once. She brought a car seat and said, "Well, you'll figure it out. You always land on your feet somehow." I did figure it out. I taught myself graphic design using library computers during Emma's nap times. I took on small projects, local business logos, wedding invitations, restaurant menus. I charged almost nothing because I had no credentials and no portfolio. But I finished everything early and I made it better than what they'd asked for. By the time Emma was 3, I was charging enough to move us to a 2-bedroom apartment without a restaurant underneath. By the time she was 5, I had steady corporate clients. By the time she was 7, I'd hired 2 contractors and was turning down work. My family didn't ask about any of this. When we saw each other at holidays, my mother's sister would say things like, "Still doing the computer stuff?" I'd say yes. She'd nod the way you nod at someone's hobby. The summer Emma turned 10, my uncle's youngest son graduated high school. There was a family dinner at their house, the kind with catering and rented tables in the backyard. Emma was excited. She just finished 5th grade with straight A's and a teacher who'd written on her report card that she was the most naturally curious student she'd taught in 15 years. We sat at a table with my mother and my aunt. Emma told them about a science project she'd done on water filtration. My aunt smiled and said, "That's sweet, honey." Then she turned to my mother and started talking about my cousin's internship at his grandfather's firm. After dinner, the adults moved to the living room. Emma followed me in. She sat on the couch next to me with a book she'd brought. My uncle was talking about his son's college plans, early acceptance to a university his wife's family had donated a library wing to. He saw Emma reading. He said, "What grade are you in now, Emma?" She looked up. "I'm going into 6th. He nodded. "And what do you want to be when you grow up?" She said. "I want to design software that helps people." My uncle smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. He said, "That's ambitious." Then he looked at me and said, "She gets that from you." The room did that thing where everyone hears the insult but pretends they don't. I said, "She works very hard." He said, "I'm sure she does." 2 weeks later, my mother called. She said the family was having dinners every Sunday now, my uncle's idea, something about keeping everyone connected. She said they'd love for me to come, but that it might be better if I came alone for a while. I said, "Why?" She said, "Your uncle thinks the conversations might be over Emma's head. He doesn't want her to feel uncomfortable." I didn't say anything. My mother kept talking. "You know how he is. He just thinks these dinners are for the adults and the older kids. His boys, your cousin's teenagers. Emma's still so young, maybe when she's older." I said, "She's 11. My mother said, "I know, honey, it's just easier this way." I asked her what my uncle had actually said. She hesitated. Then she told me. He'd said Emma wasn't smart enough to sit with the rest of the family. He'd said it would be awkward having a child at the table who couldn't keep up with the conversation. He'd said it in front of 8 people and no one had disagreed with him. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen and looked at the science fair ribbon hanging on Emma's bulletin board. Second place. District level. She'd beaten 60 kids. I didn't cry. I called my accountant. Her name was Lisa Chen, and she'd been handling my taxes for 3 years. I said, I want to know exactly how much I'm worth right now and exactly how much I can expect to be worth in 5 years if I keep doing what I'm doing. She said, planning something? I said, yes. The next day I called a business attorney. His name was Richard Moss, and he specialized in intellectual property and corporate structuring. I told him I wanted to protect what I was building. I wanted it documented. I wanted every contract, every trademark, every piece of work registered and recorded. He said, are you expecting a dispute? I said, I'm expecting to be underestimated for a long time and then I'm expecting to correct that. We got to work. I didn't tell Emma why we stopped going to family dinners. I told her we were busy. I told her we'd see everyone at the holidays. She asked a few times if she'd done something wrong. I told her she hadn't. I told her she was perfect. At Thanksgiving that year, my uncle asked how business was going. I said it was fine. He said, still freelancing? I said yes. He nodded and said, well, there's something to be said for flexibility, especially for single mothers. I smiled. I had signed a $78,000 contract the week before. My biggest client was a financial services firm that had just expanded to 4 states. They wanted me to lead a complete rebrand. Christmas was worse. My uncle's older son had just finished his first semester of college. My uncle talked about his grades for 20 minutes. He used the phrase academic excellence 4 times. His son had a 2.9 GPA. I knew because my cousin's wife had mentioned it to my mother, who told me. Emma was sitting next to me. She'd just won a regional mathematics competition, 3rd in the state for her age group. I hadn't mentioned it. My uncle looked at her and said, Emma, are you good at math? She said, I like it. He said, that's good. Math is important, even if you don't end up doing anything that uses it. I put my hand on Emma's knee under the table. I didn't respond. I had just hired my first full-time employee. Her salary was more than my uncle had made in his best year of pretending to manage properties. The years went like that. My family assumed I was getting by. I let them assume it. Every dismissive comment, every piece of condescending advice, every time someone suggested I try something more stable, I wrote it down. Not literally, but I remembered. When Emma was 13, my mother told me I should think about public speaking classes for her. She said, she's so quiet at family things, it might help her confidence. Emma had given a presentation to her entire school the month before, 200 students. She'd explained her idea for an app that would help students with dyslexia organize their assignments. She hadn't been quiet. She'd been brilliant. I told my mother I'd think about it. I called my attorney that afternoon and asked him to start preparing documentation for a formal business restructuring. I was going to incorporate. I was going to do it right. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you already know what that silence feels like. It sits in your chest. It doesn't make you angry, it makes you focused. I built my business into something most people in my family couldn't understand even if I explained it. I had contracts with corporations in 12 states. I had a team of 9 people. I had intellectual property worth more than my uncle's house. My family thought I was doing okay. They thought I was making it work. They had no idea I had passed them. By the time Emma was 15, I was profitable in ways that made my accountant pause during our quarterly calls. She said, you know you're in a different category now. You should think about estate planning, real protection. I said, I've been thinking about it for 4 years. I hired a wealth management advisor. Her name was Patricia Reyes, and she didn't ask why I needed discretion. She just built me a structure that kept everything quiet and protected. Trusts for Emma's education. Legal entities that separated my assets. Documentation that would stand up to anything. I went to family dinners twice a year. I wore normal clothes. I drove a 7-year-old sedan. I said business was steady. I let my uncle's wife tell me about sales at stores I could have bought outright. At Emma's 16th birthday, my mother gave her a gift card to a bookstore. $50. She said, I know you like to read. Emma thanked her. She was gracious. She'd been accepted into a summer program at MIT, full scholarship. I hadn't told anyone. My uncle was there. He asked Emma what she was thinking about for college. She said she wasn't sure yet. He said, well, there are good state schools. Very affordable. I sipped my coffee. I had just moved $420,000 into an education trust that Emma couldn't touch until she turned 25, managed by Patricia and structured so carefully that 3 attorneys had reviewed it. Emma got her acceptance letter from Stanford in March of her senior year. Full academic scholarship. The letter used the word exceptional twice. It mentioned her test scores, her project portfolio, and a recommendation from a professor she'd worked with during that MIT summer program. I didn't tell my family. I told Emma we'd share the news when she was ready. She said she wanted to wait until after graduation. Her graduation was on a Saturday in June. I'd invited my mother, just my mother. I'd sent the invitation 8 weeks in advance. I'd confirmed twice. The morning of the ceremony, my mother called. She said, "I hope you don't mind, but your uncle and his wife are coming." They heard about it and wanted to celebrate Emma. I asked how they'd heard. She said, "I might have mentioned it." I didn't argue. I said that was fine. I hung up and called Patricia. I said, "Is everything ready?" She said, "Everything's filed. We're ready whenever you are." I drove to the ceremony with Emma. She wore her cap and gown. She was nervous about her speech. She'd been chosen as one of 3 student speakers. I told her she'd be perfect. We got to the venue 40 minutes early. I walked Emma to the staging area where the graduates were gathering. I kissed her forehead. I said, "I'm proud of you." She said, "I know, Mom." I went to find my seat. The auditorium was filling up, families everywhere holding flowers and cameras. I saw my mother near the front. She waved. I walked toward her. My uncle was sitting next to her. Front row, 3rd seat from the aisle. His wife was on his other side. They both smiled when they saw me. My uncle stood up and hugged me. He said, "We wouldn't have missed this. Emma's such a sweet girl." I said, "Thank you." I sat down next to my mother. I didn't look at him. I had an envelope in my purse. I'd prepared it that morning. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I'd printed it myself. The ceremony started. 217 graduates, speeches from the principal, the valedictorian, and then the 3 student speakers. Emma was last. She walked to the podium. She didn't look nervous anymore. She talked about persistence. She talked about being underestimated. She talked about proving people wrong not because you're angry, but because you know what you're capable of. She didn't look at me during the speech. She didn't need to. I knew every word was true. When she finished, the auditorium stood up. My mother was crying. My uncle clapped politely. His wife said something to him I couldn't hear. The graduates walked across the stage. Emma's name was called. She received her diploma. She smiled. The photographer caught it. The ceremony ended. Families started moving toward the exits. I stayed in my seat. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope. My uncle was standing now. He was talking to my mother about where we should go for lunch. He suggested a restaurant near his house. He said, "Our treat. We want to celebrate Emma properly." I stood up. I walked directly to him. I held the envelope in my right hand. I said his name. He turned around. I handed it to him. I said she got a full scholarship to Stanford, computer science, full ride. They called her brilliant. He took the envelope. He didn't open it. He just held it. I said, "The letter's inside. You can read it if you want. It mentions her test scores. Top 2% nationally. It mentions her project portfolio. Software she designed herself. It mentions the recommendation from a professor at MIT who said she was one of the most naturally talented students he'd worked with in 20 years. My uncle's wife said, "That's wonderful." Her voice was small. I wasn't finished. I said, "You told my mother 6 years ago that Emma wasn't smart enough to sit at your family dinners. You said she couldn't keep up with the conversation. You said it would be awkward." The families around us stopped moving. I could feel them listening. My uncle said, "I don't think I said, "You did. My mother told me. You said it in front of 8 people." He didn't argue. He looked at the envelope in his hands. I said, "Emma doesn't know you said that. I never told her. But I want you to know that while you were saying it, while you were deciding she wasn't good enough, she was working. She was building something you didn't see because you weren't looking." I stopped. I could have said more. I could have told him about the business, about the numbers, about every single thing I'd built while he was assuming I was struggling. But that wasn't for him. That was mine. I turned around. Emma was standing 10 feet away. She'd been watching. She walked over and took my hand. We left. I am going to stop there for now. Part 2 drops next, and that is where everything I just described gets used. Every document, every number, every conversation. Stay right here. We drove home in silence. Emma didn't ask what had happened. She'd heard enough. When we got to the apartment, she went to her room. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand. I want to know if you would have said what I said next, because I still think about it. My mother called 20 minutes later. She was crying. She said, "How could you do that to him in front of all those people?" I said, "He did it to Emma first." She said, "That was years ago. He doesn't even remember saying that." I said, "Emma remembers not being invited." My mother went quiet. Then she said, "Your uncle is very upset. His wife is furious. They left without saying goodbye to anyone." I said, "Good." She said, "This is family. You don't humiliate family in public." I said, "Then he shouldn't have humiliated my daughter." My mother started crying harder. She said, "You've always been stubborn. You've always had to prove something. Can't you just let things go?" I said, "No." She hung up. I sat there for a long time. Emma came out of her room around 8. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What you said to Uncle David, did he really say that about me?" I looked at her. I said, "Yes." She nodded slowly. She said, "I thought maybe I'd done something wrong. Back then, I thought that's why we stopped going to dinners." I said, "You didn't do anything wrong. You've never done anything wrong." She sat down next to me. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "I don't know yet." That was Saturday. On Monday morning, my uncle called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. He said, "We need to talk about what happened. You embarrassed me and you embarrassed yourself. Call me back." I deleted it. Tuesday, my mother called again. She said the family wanted to have a meeting. She said everyone was upset and we needed to work this out like adults. I said, "Who's everyone?" She said, "Your uncle, his wife, me, your aunt. We think you owe them an apology." I laughed. I actually laughed. I said, "I'm not apologizing." He said, "Then you're not welcome at family events anymore." I said, "I haven't been welcome for 6 years. This just makes it official." She said, "You're being dramatic." I said, "I'm being honest." She hung up again. Wednesday, my uncle's wife called. I answered because I wanted to hear what she'd say. She was calm, too calm. She said, "I understand you're angry, but you've misunderstood the situation. David never meant to exclude Emma. He was trying to protect her." I said, "From what?" She said, "From feeling inadequate. The conversations at those dinners were very intellectual. He didn't want Emma to feel left out." I said, "She wouldn't have felt left out. She would have participated." She said, "Well, we can't know that now, but what you did at the graduation was cruel. You deliberately humiliated him. You made him look foolish." I said, "He made himself look foolish 6 years ago." She said, "You're holding a grudge over something he doesn't even remember saying." "That's childish." I said, "He remembers. He just didn't think it mattered." She said, "I'm calling because I think we can move past this, but you need to apologize publicly at the next family dinner." I said, "I'm not coming to family dinners." She said, "Then we have a problem." I said, "We've had a problem for 6 years. You're just noticing now." I hung up. Thursday, I got a text from my cousin, my mother's sister's daughter. We weren't close. The text said, "I heard what happened. Uncle David is telling everyone you've lost it. Just wanted you to know." I didn't respond. Friday, Patricia called. She said, "I saw your mother's Facebook post." I said, "What post?" She said, "Check it. Then call me back if you want to move forward." I opened Facebook. My mother had posted a long status. It said, "Some people care more about being right than about family. My daughter embarrassed her uncle at a public event because of a misunderstanding from years ago. I raised her better than this, praying she finds forgiveness in her heart." 43 people had liked it. 12 people had commented things like, "Family is everything and pride comes before a fall." I called Patricia back. I said, "File everything." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." She said, "This is going to be public. Once it's filed, it's on record. Your family is going to know exactly how much you're worth." I said, "Good." She said, "Okay, I'll start Monday." I said, "No." "Start now?" There was a pause. Then she said, "All right. I'll have the initial filings done by end of business today." I hung up. I sat in my kitchen and looked at my mother's post. I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet, all the times I'd smiled and nodded while they talked about their money, their connections, their children's mediocre achievements like they were miracles. I texted my mother. I said, "Family dinner this Sunday, my place, 6 p.m. I need everyone there. It's important." She texted back immediately. "What's this about?" I said, "You'll see. Tell Uncle David and his wife. Tell Aunt Marie. Tell everyone who thinks I owe them an apology." She said, "Are you going to apologize?" I said, "Just be there." Sunday morning, I cleaned my apartment. It's not large, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living room that connects to the kitchen. I'd lived there for 9 years. I'd never invited my family over. They'd never asked to visit. Patricia had sent me the documents Friday night. Everything was filed. Everything was official. I printed the relevant pages. I put them in a folder. I put the folder on the coffee table. Emma asked if she should leave. I said no. I said, "You should hear this." My mother arrived first. She looked around the apartment like she was inspecting it. She said, "It's small." I said, "It's enough." My uncle and his wife came next. They didn't hug me, they sat on the couch and didn't say anything. My aunt came last. She brought wine. She said, I thought we could all use a drink. I said, we won't be here that long. Everyone sat down. My mother kept looking at me. My uncle stared at his hands. His wife had her arms crossed. My aunt poured herself wine anyway. I stayed standing. I said, thank you for coming. My uncle said, your mother said this was important. I said, it is. He said, are you going to apologize? I said, no. His wife made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. She said, then why are we here? I picked up the folder from the coffee table. I said, I want to show you something. My mother said, what is it? I opened the folder. I pulled out the first page. It was a business registration document. I handed it to my uncle. He looked at it. He said, what is this? I said, my company, officially incorporated 3 years ago. Revenue last year was $1.2 million. The room went completely silent. My uncle looked up at me. He said, that's not possible. I said, it's public record now, filed Friday, you can verify it yourself. His wife leaned over to look at the paper. She said, this doesn't make sense, you do freelance design work. I said, I run a creative agency. I have 9 employees, I have contracts with corporations in 12 states. I've been doing this for 14 years. My mother said, why didn't you tell us? I said, you never asked. And when you did ask, you asked in a way that made it clear you thought I was barely getting by. My aunt said, well, congratulations, but I don't understand why you needed to call us all here for this. I pulled out the second page. It was a financial statement. I handed it to my mother. She looked at it. Her face changed. She said, this says your net worth is, I said, 2.4 million. Yes. My uncle stood up. He said, that's not real. You're showing us fake documents. I said, they're filed with the state. Patricia Reyes handled everything. She's a wealth management attorney. You can call her if you want to verify. His wife said, why would you hide this from us? I said, I didn't hide it, I just didn't announce it. There's a difference. If you are still here, hit like, I need to know you saw that. My uncle was staring at the document in my mother's hands. He said, even if this is real, it doesn't change what you did at the graduation. You humiliated me. I said, you told my mother that my daughter wasn't smart enough to sit at your table. You said she couldn't keep up with the conversation. You banned her from family dinners for 6 years because you decided she wasn't worth your time. He said, I was trying to make things less awkward. I said, for who? He didn't answer. I pulled out the third page. It was a trust document. I said, this is Emma's education trust. It was established 4 years ago. It's currently worth $420,000. She can't touch it until she's 25. It's managed by a trustee. Every dollar is documented and protected. My mother said, $400,000? I said, yes, for her education and her future. She doesn't need your money. She doesn't need your approval. She never did. My uncle's wife stood up. She said, this is absurd. You're showing us these papers like they prove something, so you've made some money. Good for you. That doesn't excuse what you did. I said, what exactly did I do? She said, you humiliated my husband in front of hundreds of people. I said, I told him the truth. I told him Emma got a full scholarship to Stanford. I told him she was called brilliant by people who actually know what brilliance looks like. She said, you did it to hurt him. I said, I did it because he hurt her. And none of you cared. My aunt said, that's not fair. We didn't know, I said. You knew, my mother told you what he said. She told all of you and nobody said anything. Nobody called him. Nobody told him he was wrong. You just stopped inviting my daughter and acted like it was normal. My mother started crying. She said, I thought it was easier. I thought if we just gave it time, things would smooth over. I said, it's been 6 years. She said, I know. My uncle sat back down. He looked smaller than he had 5 minutes ago. He said, I don't remember saying she wasn't smart enough. I said, yes, you do. He said, even if I did, I didn't mean it the way you're taking it. I said, how did you mean it? He didn't answer. I pulled out the 4th page. It was a tax return. I said, this is from last year. My company paid more in taxes than you made in salary. Your salary is public record because you work for your wife's family trust. I looked it up. His face went red. His wife said, how dare you? I said, you've been telling people I'm struggling. You've been offering me advice like I need saving. You've been acting like you're doing me a favor by including me in family events. And the whole time I've been out-earning you by $500,000 a year. My uncle stood up again. He said, this is insane. You're insane. You've been lying to us for years. I said, I haven't lied about anything. I just didn't correct your assumptions. He said, that's the same thing. I said, no, it's not. Lying is what you did when you told yourself you were protecting Emma. Lying is what you did when you pretended you didn't remember saying she wasn't smart enough. I just let you believe what you wanted to believe. My mother said, "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say something sooner?" I said, "Because I was watching. I wanted to see if any of you would notice. I wanted to see if any of you would ask real questions instead of making assumptions. None of you did." My aunt said, "That's not fair. We're your family, we love you." I said, "You love the version of me you made up, the struggling single mother who needs your pity and your advice. You don't know anything about who I actually am." My uncle said, "You're being cruel." I said, "I'm being honest." He said, "There's a difference." I said, "Yes, there is, and I learned it from you." The room was quiet again. My mother was still crying. My aunt was holding her wine glass but not drinking. My uncle and his wife were both standing now, like they were getting ready to leave. My uncle's wife said, "What do you want from us, an apology? Fine, I'm sorry, David's sorry, we're all sorry. Is that what you wanted to hear?" I said, "No." She said, "Then what?" I had one more thing to say. I pulled out the last page. It was a letter from Stanford, not Emma's acceptance letter, a different one. I handed it to my uncle. He read it. His hands started shaking. He said, "This is addressed to you." I said, "Yes." He said, "It's thanking you for a donation." I said, "Yes." He looked up at me. He said, "How much did you give them?" I said, $500,000, anonymous, designated for scholarships in computer science for students from low-income backgrounds. Students like Emma would have been if I hadn't built what I built. My mother said, $500,000. I said, "Yes." My uncle said, "That's more than," I said, "more than your house is worth." "Yes, I know." His wife sat down. She looked like someone had pushed her. She said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because Emma didn't need it, because other kids do, because I wanted to make sure that somewhere there's a family dinner happening where a child who's brilliant gets to sit at the table." My aunt said, "You're making a point." I said, "I'm making a difference. There's a distinction." My uncle put the letter down on the coffee table. His hands were still shaking. He said, "You've been planning this for years. You've been planning to make us look foolish." I said, "No, I've been planning to protect my daughter and build something real. Making you look foolish was just a side effect of you underestimating me." He said, "I never underestimated you." I said, "You told my mother I was doing computer stuff. You suggested I try something more stable. You looked at my daughter and decided she wasn't worth your time because you assumed she was like me, struggling, unremarkable, not worth the effort." He said, "That's not what I thought." I said, "Yes, it is." My mother stood up. She walked over to me. She said, "I'm sorry. I should have said something when he said that about Emma. I should have defended her." I said, "Yes, you should have." She said, "Can you forgive me?" I looked at her. I said, "I don't know yet." She started crying harder. My aunt put her arm around her. My uncle and his wife stood there looking at the papers on the coffee table like they were evidence in a trial. My uncle said, "What do you want from us now?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "Then why did you call us here?" I said, "Because I wanted you to know. I wanted you to see what you missed while you were busy deciding I didn't matter. I wanted you to understand that every time you gave me advice I didn't ask for, every time you looked at me with pity, every time you acted like you were doing me a favor, I was already past you. I've been past you for years." His wife said, "You're being vindictive." I said, "I'm being clear." She said, "What's the difference?" I said, "Vindictive would be posting these documents on Facebook the way my mother posted about forgiveness. Clear is showing them to you directly and letting you decide what to do with the information." My uncle picked up his jacket. He said, "We're leaving." I said, "Okay." He said, "Don't contact us again." I said, "I wasn't planning to." He walked to the door. His wife followed him. Before they left, she turned around and said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "I doubt it." They left. The door closed. My mother and my aunt stayed. My mother said, "What happens now?" I said, "You go home, you think about what I said. You decide if you want to be part of Emma's life in a real way or if you want to keep pretending." She said, "That's not fair." I said, "Life isn't fair, you taught me that." She picked up her purse. She looked at Emma, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner the whole time. She said, "I'm proud of you, Emma. I always have been." Emma said, "Thank you." My mother left. My aunt finished her wine. She said, "For what it's worth, I think you're right about all of it." I said, "Then why didn't you say anything 6 years ago?" She said, "Because I'm a coward, and because it was easier not to." I said, "At least you're honest about it." She left too. Emma and I sat in the quiet apartment. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you think they'll apologize?" "For real?" I said, "I don't know, and I don't think it matters anymore." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean I'm not waiting for them to see me. I'm done being invisible." She smiled. She said, "You were never invisible, Mom." I said, "I know, but they thought I was, and that's what mattered." My uncle tried to call twice that week. I didn't answer. His wife sent a text that said, "We need to discuss this like adults." I blocked her number. My mother called and asked if we could have coffee. I said no. She asked if I'd come to Thanksgiving. I said I hadn't decided yet. Patricia called and said, "I heard it went well." I said, "Define well." She said, "You told them the truth and nobody died." I said, "Fair enough." She said, "What's next?" I said, "I'm not sure yet." 3 months later, my uncle's older son called. He'd never called me before. He said, "I heard what happened with my dad." I said, "Okay." He said, "I just want you to know that I think you were right." He shouldn't have said that about Emma. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Is Emma really going to Stanford?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That's amazing. Tell her congratulations from me." I said, "I will." He paused. Then he said, "My dad's not doing great. He's been really quiet since that dinner. My mom says he's embarrassed." I said, "He should be." He said, "Yeah, I guess so." We haven't spoken since. Emma started at Stanford in September. She calls me every Sunday. She's thriving. She tells me about her classes, her projects, the people she's meeting. She sounds happy. She sounds free. My business is doing better than ever. I hired 3 more people this year. I'm on track to clear $3 million in revenue. I bought a house, 3 bedrooms, actual yard, neighborhood with good schools even though Emma's gone. My mother and I have coffee once a month now. We don't talk about that dinner. We don't talk about my uncle. We talk about Emma, about work, about small, safe things. It's not perfect, but it's something. I haven't seen my uncle since that Sunday. I heard through my cousin that he and his wife separated. I heard he moved to a smaller place. I heard he stopped going to family events. Last week, I got a letter in the mail. It was from him. It said, "I'm sorry for what I said about Emma. I was wrong. I hope someday you can forgive me." I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure I will. But this morning, something happened that I think you need to hear. My uncle's younger son, the one who graduated with the 2.9 GPA, showed up at my office. He said he'd been thinking about going back to school. He said he wanted advice. He said his father suggested he talk to me. I told him to come back next week. We'd talk then. Do you think I should help him, or is that letting them off too easy?